Welcome to our episode of Biblical Archaeology from the Ground Down. Sponsored by Bible Interact and hosted by Dr. George Sparks. Today's special guest is experienced field archaeologist Dr. David E. Graves. Now let's explore the field of archaeology in today's episode.
Today, we're exploring the women of Mesopotamia, as revealed through the fascinating lens of cuneiform primary sources collected from those clay tablets that give us a direct line to the past. And we've got a special guest to guide us, Dr. Mark Chavalas, a renowned historian and expert on Mesopotamian culture.
Welcome. This is Biblical Archaeology from the Ground Down, sponsored by Bible Interact. Today I have a special guest, Professor Mark Chavalas, and he is from the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. He received his PhD from the University of UCLA. He also has a connection of studies. His research in past decades has been a center of interconnections with ancient Mesopotamia and the outlying areas of Anatolia and the Aegean, Iran, Egypt, and Syro-Palestine. He is also focused on issues such as gender, which we're going to talk about today in his book, Women in the Ancient Near East. How exciting is that? And Mesopotamian history. And also it says, my current research concerns a history of Bronze Age Syria from the advent of writing in the mid-3rd century BC to the Iron Age. So this is going to be a very interesting program. Professor, welcome to our podcast.
Well, it's really good to be here. Thank you very much, both of you.
Great. Look forward to it.
Yeah.
We hear a lot about women in our culture and our society today, so this is a perfect opportunity for us to see what they had to say and believe in the ancient world.
The introduction of his book right here, I've been outlining throughout the pages, but this is the way it starts, folks.
Today we start by stepping into the world of Herodotus, the Greek writer often dubbed the father of history. In his sprawling work, The Histories, and sometimes called the Persian Wars, Herodotus takes us on a journey through the ancient Near East, including a stop in Babylon. Herodotus likely visited the region himself, and his eyewitness flair shines through. Let's hear what he has to say about the Babylonians as we begin our podcast. Picture this. It's around 450 BC, and Herodotus, with his weathered sandals and insatiable curiosity, stands amid the dusty splendor of Babylon, or at least recalls it vividly for his Greek audience. In the Histories, Book 1, he paints a picture of a city unlike any other. He writes, and George is quoting here,
it says, once a year in every village all the maidens, as they attained marriage age, were collected and brought together into one place, with a crowd of men standing around crying, and a crier would display, so he's displaying the women, and offered them for sale one by one. First, the fairest of them all, kind of like a Disney program. First, the fairest of them all. And then the next, most attractive, selling all the maidens as lawful wives. And that's how we're starting the book. Man, that's interesting stuff. So, David, you had some questions you want to lead in with?
Well, we could do that. Or did you want to say something there,
Maybe I should say something there about that. Now, that's of course the beginning of the introduction that I wrote to the book, and that's from Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian who claims to have gone to Babylon. I'm pretty sure that he did. In fact, so we're looking at the end of his first book when he talks about Babylon, and he starts talking about Babylonian customs. And I actually expanded upon this and wrote an article about it in Conversations in the Biblical World. And I can send this to you folks once we're done here. But I'm convinced that Herodotus did go to Babylon, and he tried to understand Babylonian culture. He saw certain things. The second part of what's happening here is what he calls the foulest Babylonian custom, where a woman has to go to one of the temples of Mylitta, which we think is we found the Assyrian goddess Mulisu in text, but that they go there and they have to engage in sexual activity with a stranger before they are able to get married. Well, Herodotus is discussing something that he's observing, but I think that he's misunderstood it completely. But he didn't just make it up out of thin air. He also, by the way, talks about the Babylonian custom of not having any doctors. And so if you need a doctor, you just bring your sick person out on a mat and ask passersby what you could do with them. Well, we know that there's extensive texts about Babylonian medicine and physicians and doctors. You might call them witch doctors. And so why is Herodotus doing this? He's understood things incorrectly, of course, and that's what's going on. And so he's not making it up. And so I just started with this to show that if you think about it, in terms of ancient Mesopotamia, what did we know about Mesopotamian customs before the advent of the decipherment of the cuneiform script, which, by the way, is only about 175 years ago? It would be statements like this in Herodotus, and of course isolated statements that we have in the Bible, and maybe Diodorus, the classical writer, and a few others. And so we had very skewed ideas about them. So my goal in this book was to try to simply look at documents. In fact, maybe I can even bring this up. When I began teaching at the University of Wisconsin, which, by the way, I'm recently retired, so I'm emeritus. And what it means to be emeritus is that you get full library privileges, and that's all that mattered to me. In fact, even today, once we're done here, I'm running over to the library, which is just 2 blocks for me, and I get full library privileges until I expire. And so that's the big deal. But anyway, when I began teaching there, I did not incorporate women into my study very much, and I would constantly have students, and this is in the late 80s, early 90s, come up and say, I really liked your lecture, blah, blah, blah. What about women? And I always had a canned answer for them. Well, we really don't know much about them in the ancient text. The study of them hasn't been synthesized very well yet. And of course, this was happening in many other areas of history. Certainly, this began happening in the late 60s, early 70s in our culture, when we had, of course, major social changes in the West. And so there were now major social changes in how we tried to understand our own history. Well, I had my easy answer, and I was satisfied. The students weren't. And then in the mid-90s, I noticed there was an NEH seminar at Brown University on women in the ancient Near East. And I said, well, I'm an ancient Near Eastern person, so I signed up for it. Somehow I got into it, and we received a boatload of documents to look at, mostly Mesopotamia, because of course the cuneiform sources are so gigantic. And I came back and basically created a course on women in the ancient world. I couldn't just do ancient Near East because it was an undergraduate course, and so I did ancient Near East, biblical material, and classical. And I didn't go any further than that, because the closer you get to the present, the less comfortable I am with information. In fact, I joke with my students that anything that happened past the fall of the Roman Empire is just current events, which, by the way, was actually a little offensive to some of my modern history scholars. But
it was interesting that when we were doing our excavations, I was in charge of the Roman period area, Tel Hammam, and Gary always referred to, oh, David's over there doing that modern stuff.
Yeah, well, I can appreciate Gary, and knowing Gary as I do now, I can see with a gleam in his eye, he would be saying that. And very nice and friendly. In any event, I taught this course, and at the time, by the way, there were no syntheses. And so I wanted to simply look at primary sources and nothing else, no commentary. And so every day I would come with Xerox copies for 30 students, about 150 pages for each student that I had copied myself, and dump them in their laps. And I said, all right, this is what we're doing next week. This week, we're going to look at this document from this source and that source. And I got tired of doing it. And so I contracted with Rutledge to put a series of documents together. It was too overwhelming for me to do by myself, and so I conscripted a bunch of scholars to work on it. My favorite volumes, my favorite chapters in my book are the ones by Martha Roth, which is looking at women in law, and I think Joanne Scurlock's work on women in medicine. But I have to tell you, when you try to incorporate women in the ancient textual record, whether it's ancient Near East or the Bible, I have to say that the documents aren't particularly interested in providing you information. So in other words, if you say, what were women like in the Bible? The biblical writer is not interested in that question. So we're asking questions that they're not interested in answering. It's not that they're denying us, but you have to sort of, extract blood out of a turnip. And
Also,
yes.
I wonder if you started with Herodotus. And,
Yeah.
Here we have a Greek writing about the Babylonians, the Mesopotamian culture. If we have similar issues today with us imposing perhaps our view of women from our day on their ideas back then, and kind of mixing things up and confusing the reality of what's really there, rather than, and I like the idea that you're starting with primary sources, because that's really the only way we're going to find out what they thought and believed and practiced.
Right. In fact, I think you're absolutely right. And of course, this is a problem that historians have in every aspect. If you think about it, it's bias. And part of the bias that I have, for example, is I can't help. I can't help that I was born in the mid 20th century, that I'm a male. I joke that my ethnicity is Greco-Californian, which is very unique. And so, in other words, I have a particular religious bent. I'm an evangelical Christian. So I come to the text with some preconceived notions. I think in English, which is different than thinking in Spanish, and it's definitely different than thinking in Biblical Hebrew or thinking in Akkadian, which was the language. So I have to be aware of these things. And I would have students say, well, you're teaching a course on women, but you're not a woman. I said, well, I start off by saying, well, if we're teaching French history, would you rather learn French history for somebody who was French or somebody who wasn't French? And they were all sort of confused by it. And I said, well, the answer is yes. In other words, I can get some intimate understanding of what it means to be a French person by somebody who's French, but I can also learn it from somebody from the outside. So I said, if you're going to take a lot of French history, take it from a French person and take it from a non-French person. Same thing about the history of women. Take it from somebody who's a female, from somebody who's not a female. And so you're going to get different perspectives. And as long as I'm aware of that, and I'm trying not to convince you of a particular bent, that's true. Now, by the way, one of my favorite scholars, who was a Mesopotamian scholar who did women's history, was Tikva Frymer-Kensky, who unfortunately passed away, but she worked on goddesses, and she was especially upset that modern people who were not scholars were taking, the ancient texts and appropriating them for their particular social bent. And so I have to be extra sensitive to that when I'm trying. And so my goal was simply to try to look at the text and let the text speak for themselves. It doesn't mean that my bent towards it is the correct one. It's the best shot I have, but it really is no different than looking at any other field of history or any other aspect of history. And so when I talk about women, I tell my class, well, I'm trying to incorporate women into the record. And where are women found? Most of the time it's in administrative texts. In the Bible, for example, you think about it, women, let's say in Genesis, are either very, very naughty or they have very naughty things happen to them. And so if you're looking for the average garden variety woman, well, she didn't make the cut. And for example, but men didn't either. In other words, the whole point in other words, if you're looking for normal everyday life in the book of Genesis, you're not going to find it. The goal was to talk about the abnormal things. So what's the normal? I try to extract it from anecdotal pieces of information. Rebecca jumping off of a camel rather than gliding off of it. Well, that means there must have been camels hanging around there. Little anecdotal pieces of information. That's what I'm looking for. So
and for our audience to understand as well, we have the the Greeks are sitting down writing treatises on specific topics and ideas, wherein we don't find that so much in Mesopotamia. Like we have some of the medical documents from the ancient Near East, but by and large, it was the Greeks that were sitting down writing these categorical kind of treatises on women or on love or on whatever topics they might be interested in at that particular time in their culture. You know, it's a bit of a misnomer. We're not going to find generally those kinds of writings. So you're having to extract our ideas from their cultural practices and from the settings in which we find women. And those are not always the same as we find
No,
today.
in fact, to look at it this way, in Mesopotamia, though there is an overwhelming amount of cuneiform information, there's not a lot of self-reflection. And so do they have historians? Yes. However, most of the Mesopotamian historians are from the classical period. And for example, Berosus, good news, we have Berosus. Bad news is his works didn't survive in there, and we have extracts in later writers, including Josephus, the Jewish classical writer. And so there is some self-reflection, but it's very fragmented. In fact, we've always had these fragments of Berosus, but we've never really known what to do with them. And so when we're looking at, for example, law codes, which are, I usually start with the law codes because they're the easiest to grasp. But if you look at them, it appears that women seem to be very passive. And my response to that is that's the whole point of the legal text, is that you're looking at things which happen to people, whether it's male or female. And so from the legal standpoint, it looks at women are passive. But when you start looking at administrative texts, you begin to realize that women probably have a lot more social power. And I think the analogy is the modern Middle East. So as a young man, I did my field work in my 20s and 30s. And so this is in the 70s and the 80s. And we sort of naively thought when we went into the inland Syria, we were along the Euphrates and in the desert and other areas. So these are small villages that probably look pretty much the same as they had during the time of Jesus, except for each house having a TV aerial, and you would occasionally see a 1953 Chevy go by. And in any event, it looked as if the women were quite subservient to men, till we started chatting with them and began realizing that they were really running the family. We might have naively thought, we're here to help you understand how things are in the West, but then they would ask our women, so honey, so you're over here, and what are you doing over here? You're digging in the dirt for 3 months out of the year. You get all sweaty. Do you have a family at home? Most of them did not. And they said, so you come over here and dig in the dirt, and here I am with my whole family. I've got my children over here. I've got my grandchildren over here. My entire family, I get to see them every day, and we're enjoying each other all the time. How is that for you? And of course, the excavator is going to say, well, no, I'm, at this point in my life, I'm doing this and this. And so I really don't have much of a family. And so they're thinking, and you think your life is better than mine? And so it helped us understand from a perspective that they had a very different perspective and different value of it, a very different value system. And they weren't pining for us to come over and help them change that. And they really considered themselves a stronger gender in the sense that men were not always out in the workforce because there was nothing to do, especially when there wasn't farming season. And they would either work for us or would sit at the tea houses, and the women were doing all the heavy lifting at home, and they didn't want the men to come back and help them. So I had to realize, I wonder if that's what's happening in Mesopotamia. So yes, the man was the head of the family, but when it came to running things, you could tell that there was an undercurrent that doesn't always show in the record of women really in power and control. And I think you can see it occasionally in some of the biblical stories, and I think you'll be asking about some of this material. So
yeah, Genesis 15 and 16, we have the idea of the adoption for children, for couples, and then also for the children by proxy that's mentioned in Genesis. I think you've alluded to this. The practice reflects more of a different kind of a social structure and status, an agency of women in that ancient Near Eastern culture than perhaps what we have today in our culture.
Well, very much
we,
so.
we
In
can't
fact,
impose our ideas upon them and say
yeah.
they had to work like we think.
I think both in the Bible and, let's say, in Mesopotamia, one of the overarching desires that humans have is to make sure that their family line continues. And of course we still have that desire, but I think it's not. We don't think of it in the same way they do. They are almost desperate to make sure their family line continues. Now, in Mesopotamia, of course, when I die, I'm going to be buried in the ground. Let's say if it's the city of Ur, I'm probably buried underneath one of the floors in the house that I was raised in. And my descendants are now going to continue taking care of me. I'm still part of the family, but I don't get around as well as I used to because I'm now buried, but I still need food and sustenance. And so my firstborn, by the way, is usually going to be the one who's going to be taking care of this avenue of feeding me. In fact, this is probably why the firstborn got the double inheritance, because they were there to take care. They were the insurance policy for the parents. And this might continue on for at least a couple of generations. In fact, and I think in Israel, we think of the patriarchs as perhaps being theologically astute. I think that they're probably not theologically astute. And the whole point of it is for God to help them understand how things are changing. You used to think about it. Abraham's a pagan Mesopotamian. Does he understand everything about God after three little brief meetings in Genesis? Probably not. And so he probably has the same ideas about the afterlife. And you think about it, even at the end of Genesis, Joseph, I'll sort of paraphrase. What does Joseph say to his, or both, well, Jacob and Joseph say to their families, so I'm going to die and you're going to stay here for 400 years, but make sure my bones go with you. I don't want to stay here. And of course, the end of the book of Joshua, it makes it clear we brought them back. They're, even at the beginning of the Exodus, we've got the bones. We didn't keep them here. And so it's almost a fanatical idea that I have this existence. And so where I end up is really, really important. So now what I'm bringing up is that I want to make sure that my life as I get older is going to be comfortable, and especially after I die. So let's say let's look at Genesis 15 right now. We think of Abram and Sarah. Let me just call him Abraham because it's easier to use the name that he'll be given. So Abraham and Sarah are obviously older. They have no hope of having a biological child at this point. And at that point, their inheritor is where we're told, in fact, God comes to him in a vision at the beginning of Genesis 15, and he sort of reiterates what he had told him twice before. Oh, by the way, I'm going to bless you, Abraham. And of course, Abraham's first thought was, hey, this hasn't happened yet, and what are you talking about? My heir is now Eleazar. And this probably reflects the practice that we have found at the city of Nuzi in northern Mesopotamia, which was excavated in the 20s and 30s, about 5,000 or 6,000 tablets. And we have what you might call fictional adoption there, where elderly people would adopt someone who would now take care of them. And so they're, in a sense, they're fictional child. They're probably not children. They're certainly not children. They're adults. In a sense, it's like you and I, saying, well, our kids aren't helping me right now. I'm not getting around very well. I've got to hire somebody to come in to be my in-house caretaker. But I can't pay them. And so they're going to inherit from me. In other words, that might encourage them to sort of care for me in a way that might cause my demise quicker. But the point was, this was a system that seemed to have been somewhat typical. And by the way, we're not told any of this in Genesis. The goal isn't to help understand the practice. It's giving us something anecdotal, in the same way that if you and I are, here I'm in Wisconsin. If I want to connect with you as a Wisconsinite, I'm going to start talking about the Packers and wearing cheese hats, and I'll talk about cows and other things. And let's say somebody from 5024 is listening to this interview and thinking, who are the Packers and what's football? And, it's like, well, so in other words, or if I say something about, our current administration, or whatever, I wouldn't need to explain it all to you, but I would to them. And so the biblical writer, of course, isn't explaining all that. So So we probably have I'm guessing this is some sort of fictional adoption where Eleazar is probably the caretaker of their estate and them, and now the inheritor. And God saying, no, 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 that's not what my plan was. You're going to have a biological child, which of course probably sounded utterly ridiculous to Abraham because he was, as far as we can tell, far past childbearing age, and certainly his wife was. And we have hundreds, literally hundreds of these texts from Newsy especially that talk about this practice, which either means their children were living far away, or they were estranged from their children, or their children didn't have the finances to be able to take care of them, and so they had to take matters. In fact, we will actually find people who are adopted by multiple families. And so, in other words, if you're a mover and a shaker in the town of Newsy, you might get adopted by a dozen families. And so you've got a lucrative business going on. Or the converse would be, and we might talk about this in some future talk, let's say I'm in big trouble. I'm a woman whose husband has died and I have no means of caring for my small children. I might become your servant temporarily, and so I attach myself to you. You're gonna now basically take care of me, but I'm now working for you, which, by the way, which is slavery. And so there's all sorts of things going on here. The biblical writers, of course, aren't telling us any of this, but it seems to be hinted at. And so let's say Genesis 15, there's a hint of this adoption process. But in fact, if you look at what commentators say, some of them will say, oh yeah, this looks like Newsy adoption. Other commentators say, oh no, it doesn't say that it is, and so it's not. So my answer is it's probably somewhere in between.
Yeah, we often, I think, interpret scripture more from our Western values and ideas,
Yes.
and we're looking back at these stories thinking, oh, these are strange and they can't be true because they're just so outlandish to our thinking. And
Yeah.
that's the problem. We're looking at them through Western eyes or Greek eyes rather
Yeah.
than through ancient Near Eastern eyes. So the Newsy tablets certainly do help us understand the role and the influence of women much better than for us to try and figure it out and impose it on from our own political and cultural roles of women in our day.
In fact, I will tell my students, once we've looked at this material, if you're not a little bit more confused, then I didn't do my job.
Right.
I said, you get new information, you think, oh, that settles it. No, it doesn't. It just causes a whole new set of questions. But I must have a different disposition, because for me, that's fun. It means I've got more work to do. And now that I've been studying this for really, I became an ancient history student midway through undergraduate school. So it's been over 50 years. I'm thinking, am I done yet? No, I'm just getting started.
As an archaeologist, that's the thing I love, is that you end up becoming a detective, and it's the hunt and the search for the elusive and trying to figure out the puzzle. That's why I enjoy it so much.
Yes.
George, you had a question?
Yeah, I think for the listening audience, when we look at our culture and we want to impose our culture on the ancient, I think most of the time now our family moves away.
Yeah, exactly.
And in ancient culture, such as if you were digging, let's say in the Near East, like Pernaum, and we read where Jesus went to Peter's house. And it's quite a large establishment, that house, because it's Jesus and his 12 disciples are there. Yeah. And in the excavation, they actually found out that location, I'm just going to say that house, which is really called, let's say, where they add to the house, because the family is growing and they add to the house, was actually there for almost, you can say, the foundation, the establishment of the house for 100 years.
Yeah. So
somebody's living there, and as they live there, it's growing and it's growing. And it must have been quite large for Jesus and his disciples to be there. Now, what you said, Doctor, is that's not exactly the case either, because if somebody gets older and they have to hire somebody somebody's got a hospice business in the ancient world. Yeah. And now where's their family at? So I guess, of course, illness back then, I don't think I'd last 2 weeks in the ancient world. And, there's death. And then if you're drafted into the military, or maybe there was a siege on the city, you're taken away. And there's all kinds of things, because let's say the young and the healthy be taken away, and would be left? The elderly. Maybe that would be. We don't know.
And in the Middle East today, we still have this idea, when you're driving through the streets, and whether in Jordan or in Israel, You see rebar sticking out of the top of all of the buildings.
Yes.
All the houses. Why? Well, because they would expand their family, and as they did that, the children would move upstairs, or the grandparents would move upstairs, and you just kept building upwards because the family stayed together, which was a concept that, as George, you said, today it's like you want to get away from the family and move away from home, and people are all over the United States and Canada. And,
Well, you know,
Yeah, and there's a reason for that. I alluded to it at the beginning, or if you've got grandma and grandpa buried underneath the floor where you are, you're not going to be willing to, to sell your property. In fact, if you planned, we, the city of Nippur, which was the Mesopotamia religious center, somewhere at the end of the old Babylonian period, there's a rash of sales of land sales. And that's usually indicative of something terrible that's going on. So in other words, if you have to sell your family land that has been in your family for the last 10 generations, that's going to be emotionally gut-wrenching for you. But it's even worse if you know that grandma and grandpa and great-grandma and grandpa are buried underneath and they're still there. In other words, they have a consciousness. Tragic.
Also, Mark, at Tel Hammam, I had the privilege of actually finding a child burial under the floor.
Wow.
In my square, and there were others that were found as well. So, you don't want to leave your children behind also, as well as grandma and grandpa. So there's a lot of history under their feet, under their kitchen. And
Yes.
You're right. They don't want to leave that behind. And that was much more ingrained in their thinking, because for them, their children was their life and their inheritance and their
Yes.
future. And we've lost a sense of that, I think, in our own culture, and need to get that back.
I did my dissertation on domestic architecture at the city of Terka, an Amorite town just north of Mari on the Euphrates, Old Babylonian period. Well, I basically did my whole dissertation on a portion of a private house. The owners, we found about 100 fragments of tablets in an area of dead storage there. The name of the owner was Puzarum, which I suppose in Akkadian would be something like sleepy. I don't know where the other 6 dwarves were, but sorry, can't help it. But
That's good.
But in any event, it's only a portion of the house, and it was clearly abandoned at some point during a burning. And then it looks like squatters might have come back there a generation or two later, and I don't know whether it was from his family or somebody else's. And then there's a period of complete abandonment afterwards, and so we don't know anything about what happened to the family or in the area surrounding it. Now, by the way, at Newsy, when I talked about these movers and shakers, most of the excavations at Newsy were done in suburb areas, and they were large residences. And so the small residences that might be where families were a little, more modest. First of all, they probably couldn't afford to have scribes, and so they don't have any writing. And so by definition, when we find documents, you and I, of course, if we're average middle class, of course, we have lots of documents in writing because we've democratized things in our culture. But in the ancient culture, we probably would have been at the lower end of the totem pole, and we probably would be either working for somebody else and certainly would not be able to afford scribes. If you and I want to exchange either land or, let's say, children for marriage or what have you, we'd have to have some sort of documentation for it, but it would be expensive. Just like today, we'd have to hire a lawyer, even a real estate lawyer, if we're going to, buy or sell property to each other. And so in fact, 90% of our texts from Mesopotamia are administrative in nature. And so they just come right out, with, to me, this is the best way to try to understand the nature and status of women is by looking at these documents. So for example, at Emar, which is even further up on the Euphrates, both Old Babylonian, but most of the documents were from the late Bronze Age that have been found at Emar. We have a really interesting custom where a husband in his will is designating his wife as father and mother of the children. In other words, she's now been designated as a father. So in other words, if I die, my wife is now the official head of the household. And the only way to be a head of a household is to be a father. So she's now a fictional father. And in the proviso of the will, usually it'll say, if wife so-and-so decides to get remarried, she relinquishes the entire property. Because of course, if you're a woman, think about this, this happens in the Bible too. You know, a young girl, when she marries outside of her family. She might continue to have an emotional relationship with her family, but she now has a legal relationship with her husband's family. She now marries in, if it's Mesopotamia, into their family gods. That's why we have such a very strange situation, you know, with Jacob and Laban and the teraphim. You know, these guys aren't good traditional monotheists yet, that's for sure.
These little gods that they would carry.
You know, so they're marrying into the new family. And so if I want to get remarried, I'm actually, the leveret would be the idea that I stay within that in my husband's family. But if I don't, if I decide to go out of that husband's family, it's usually out of duress. In other words, they can't afford to keep me, or I've chosen to relinquish everything, which nobody's going to do. I mean, that would be. And so the documents tell us what the norms are, but there's usually ways to get around it. We find out. And so women look passive until you, I think, look behind the scenes, and they're really no different. I look at it this way. When you look at male and female personality, is there one gender that has stronger personality? No. You might say that women and men might reflect their strong personalities in somewhat different ways, but they're just as strong. And so if I'm a woman, I will keep to the social standards of the day, but I will want to make sure that I can manipulate things the way I want them. And of course, that's the Genesis 38 passage about Tamar.
Right. So to tie a bow around it, we're kind of finding the tablets from the Amarna tablets and the Nuzi tablets and the Ebla tablets, and they all seem to give us some ideas and clues as to these practices and strange kind of stories that we read in Genesis. Whereas we didn't understand what's going on in some of the, why is somebody calling their wife their sister?
Yes.
And those kinds of ideas, which is bizarre to us, but as you explain, it makes sense when you understand the cultural context of the family and women and their role.
Right. You call your wife your sister, that sort of cements her into the family. She's now literally she's legally part of the family now, whatever happens to me. Now, of course, the commentators have said lots about that with Abraham as well. Actually, maybe she was his actual half-sister, and if she wasn't, she's now legally his sister. And I don't exactly know how that works. Of course, it's not being described to us, but with sonship and daughtership and other things happening in the ancient Near East, it certainly seems to work in that environment. It doesn't go against the cultural norms.
Also, we should remember that the British Museum still holds approximately 130,000 cuneiform tablets awaiting translation, meaning there remains a vast amount of knowledge that we still haven't recovered.
And yesterday we had on Brett Steels. He's one of the specialists who did the radar of the papyrus that were charred at Mount Vesuvius at Herculaneum, and has been able to read the text that has been long lost. And so there's a lot of even the Greco-Roman material, and now that we're using AI to work on these cuneiform tablets as well. So there's so much more that we're learning about the ancient cultures. So who knows what tomorrow will bring, and we'll get to maybe understand these things a little bit better. But it's a mistake for us to try and impose, our thinkings and our beliefs from our Western Greco-Roman culture on those, cultures from the Levant.
Well, it's a constant temptation. I just remember being in Syria and learning enough Arabic to interact with my workers. And so it was probably about a second grade Arabic, but I found myself one season in the mid 80s, I was basically the only Westerner on the dig for about a month. And I found myself thinking in second grade Arabic. And I said, wow, this is really different. And I had to realize that is actually a very different worldview. In the same way that, as a kid, if you learn some Spanish living in Southern California, the Spanish language thinks differently about the world. You think hace frio in Spanish means it's cold. But it doesn't translate the same way because there's no subject. It really means God makes it cold. And that's very different than it's cold, which is sort of generic in English. And so there's a whole different worldview. And so I have to constantly remind myself.
And we literally read it backwards.
Yeah. So when I'm learning Akkadian or somebody learning biblical Hebrew, you're really entering into a very, very different worldview, and you've got to try your best to engage it. You can't, but you ultimately can't disassociate completely. I mean, that's the whole point of doing that, is so I can make myself understandable and present myself to a modern world.
Yeah. So as we tie up today, what do you think we can learn? We sometimes take the present and go back, but now if we take the past, the back, go forward, what can we learn from this for our maybe our own cultures and generations? What would be some of the life lessons we have for the audience?
Well, when I started this, my goal was to try to understand the Bible in its context. And my colleague, John Walton, I don't know if he came up with this phrase, but it's very well worn. He said, the Bible was written for us, but not to us. And so, in other words, it doesn't have a direct line to us. It wasn't written in English. It wasn't written for the 21st century audience. And so I have to try to reconstruct the ancient environment as best I can. And when I do that, I suppose it's like looking at a TV that you and I might have grown up with when we were kids. You look at a little black and white screen that's, 10 inches, and it's like, boy, this is really fun. I got to watch my cartoons. They're in black and white. And then back then, if you were to be given an HD 60-inch screen, you'd look at that and say, wow, you can do that? And then you say, I don't want to go back to my cartoons from, 1959 or whatever it was. That doesn't look very interesting anymore. So now when I look at, for example, the passage in Genesis 16, when Sarah is telling Abram here, go into my maid, you're thinking, well, that's really weird. What's going on here? Now I have a whole cuneiform world that can help me try to understand that context. And if I understand the context better, then I can understand what's happening better. And then ultimately, to me, it's a spiritual thing. I can understand what God is trying to project to that audience. And then I can basically, I'm sitting in the back row listening in. And now I can at least understand what the original intent of the author was. And so it's not just...
To stay with your analogy, it really brings color to the text.
Yes, it brings color to the text. And so people ask me, do I have to do this? And I said, well, no. I said, but it's sort of icing on the cake. I said, I probably learned everything I really needed to know about God and the Bible when I was 4 years old. And maybe everything I learned since then are footnotes, but they're really cool footnotes.
The black and white cartoons we saw were still fun and interesting. It's just when they are in full color, they just bring them to life, and it makes it much more exciting for us as humans. And I think that's maybe the lesson.
Yes, and because of the advent of the internet, everyone now has access to this material. Yes, of course, you still should spend 7 years studying Akkadian, but you can now look at Akkadian material and compare it to Biblical Hebrew. You can look at Bible Hub, or you can look at Strong's Concordance online, and so you can learn all of these things. As long as you don't make yourself authoritative, you at least you have access to what all the scholars have, and even access to all the cuneiform material. So you can now start looking at it and make your own judgments.
And I used to tell my students, it's okay to say I don't know.
Oh yeah, that's something.
So we can still learn, and there's still much more archaeology to dig out there, and more squares to uncover, hopefully more tablets. So those are always fun. We're still looking for the tablets at Tel El Hammam. So
I know. The
problem is we're becoming artifacts. That's what it is. Look at us. Really cool.
Well, I was just out there in Albuquerque, with Stephen and Gary giving some talks in September, and so they're still looking for those things. And I said, if you find them, I'll come.
Of course, we've got a couple of scarabs and a little bit of that stuff. Boy, those tablets would be great if we found the
Well,
storehouse of those.
Stephen showed me a lot of the blank tablets that you have from
Yes.
there, and my goodness, and that he's just an action figure. That's all I can say. Stephen, he's
Yeah, it's
amazing.
quite a privilege to work on the site with him over those years.
I'm sure of that.
Yeah.
You know, my son, he's like 14 going on 15, and he's watching Nick at Night. And he looks at me and he goes, Dad, now Nick at Night is like reruns, right?
Yeah.
And he's looking at me and he goes, Dad, what reruns did you watch when you were young? I said, son, I said, when I was your age, we didn't have reruns.
Yeah. The original.
That's right.
If
We
you
were the
missed it,
reruns.
Yeah. Retreads. We're the retreads.
Well, any other question there, George? Or do you want to wrap up? Or
Yeah, it's been very interesting and a lot of fun. You know, if you would, I'd like to invite you back, Doctor.
Sure.
And of course, I invite people to read the book. This has got a lot of really cool information on it. Women in Ancient Near East. And this is Professor Emeritus, see, I do listen, Professor Emeritus Mark Chavalas. So I do recommend it, people. It's a lot of fun, and it's very, very interesting. It gives excellent insight on areas that we don't consider because of the culture of where we are and how we're raised, and it's just the way we're brought up and the way we think.
Yeah.
And it helps us understand the biblical narrative. So with that, no, ever appreciate David, appreciate your time here. Mark, yours also. When you're in town, say I'm in Rio Rancho. I'm right up the hill, like 10 minutes. So I'm 10 minutes away from Trinity Southwest.
Well,
and I keep it.
Come out every 2 years in December, it looks like. So,
well, that'd be great.
Yeah.
And I'm way up the road in Canada, so I'm
so the thing is, we had Gary on the program, you know, and one time we had I'll say Gary or Dr. Byers, and he's dean of Trinity Southwest University, so everybody knows. And I was talking to him on a podcast, and I realized, you know, the week before, he was in Jerusalem. And now I'm talking to him on a Zoom podcast, and he's just right down the road. I'm thinking like Gary, I said, we could have got together and just been right here.
Yeah, that's pretty fun.
That would be fun. And I'm sure our listening audience would enjoy it just as much. Yeah, very much.
Well, I've really enjoyed it, Mark. Thanks very much.
My pleasure.
It's helpful to talk about the old things again.
Yeah.
The old
My
stuff.
pleasure. A lot of fun. And yes, I'd love to come back.
Maybe next time we could talk about slavery, as you brought it up. We could explore that a little bit. And
well, there's tons of areas out there. Matter of fact, I was listening to some other podcasts, Doctor, that you were on. Mm-hmm. And in the areas that you talked about, this is just a fraction of the subject matters that could just go on and on and on. Look for you to be on our program again. Everybody, thanks for watching. And I think we're at like 192,000 subscribers. Thank everybody very much. And you know what to do. So like, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next podcast. Thank you very much for your time, gentlemen.
You're welcome.